Welcome back to Conversations, the Leaky Cauldron, episode 25, Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, chapters 20 through 25. And back with me are my esteemed and magical colleagues, Miss Sarah Miller and Mr. Wesley Schantz. Welcome back, you two. I'm happy to be doing this.
Yeah, welcome.
Yeah, welcome back.
Thank you.
Good to get started again.
It's good to get started. It's funny because the listeners who listen presently probably knows that we took a little time off, and it's almost like we were all three Harry Potter returning to the cupboard or Dudley's second room in order to sort of restore ourselves for a month or so until we reconnected with the magical world. And so here we are again. Finally, an owl has shown up, or a car has broken through our door, or Dumbledore is at the door. Maybe too soon to say that sort of thing. Sorry, because the specter of him has sort of haunted us throughout the course of this book. But it's good to be doing this back with y'all. These last couple of weeks have been so much about return for me, having returned to St. John's, all three of our graduate alma mater, too, for a week, which was wonderful, too, in the magical Santa Fe Mountains. But so before we started in the pre-show, Wes had given the sage suggestion that we go sort of chronologically through this, and I think that's wonderful. And so perhaps we could start with Xenophilius Lovegood, who has such an interesting name and such an interesting periodical, and is Luna's father. And so, I guess, Wes, since you brought up that method of going through this, what is it about our encounter with Xenophilius Lovegood that you found interesting, that you thought that we might want to dig into first?
I thought one kind of cool thing, I'm always interested whenever there's writing within the book, right? But so he has the sign, or a series of signs in front of his house. And they sort of sum up what you've got here. You've got the Quibbler, editor X Lovegood, and then pick your own mistletoe, and then keep off the dirigible plums. So this sort of sum up like what you're getting with Xenophilius, right? Or what you might expect you're getting. On the one hand, yeah, he's like the editor of this wonderful offbeat publication that has so far told the truth, although that changes here. He's got that love theme, like very in your face with his name, and the mistletoe. I take that to be a kind of allusion to that as well. You know, he wants to spread love. And then, keep off the dirigible plums. He's also kind of kooky, but maybe not entirely wrong. And we see that with his story of the three brothers and the Deathly Hallows. So there's a lot of interesting stuff going on there with, intelligence, communication, sharing and opening up, but then also like this dangerous quality of certain kinds of esoteric knowledge that he sort of believes in and has a tough time kind of supporting.
I love that because just a couple things about him. His name itself, Xenophilius, means lover of the strange. Philius, philia, love, like philosopher, lover of wisdom, and xeno, like xenophobic, that which is strange. Actually, the idea xenia goes back to Homer, the idea of the guest-host relationship, that the holiest relationship honored by the Greeks. And so that's very interesting, especially given the sort of hospitality or lack of hospitality that he gives to Harry, seeming to be somewhat two-faced at this moment, but perhaps because he's under pressure because of his daughter. But something you mentioned about the dirigible plums, I believe we get a description of their effect at some point that says that they open your mind to that which is a little more mysterious, or open your mind to that which seems a little more fantastic. And just something interesting about that with him is I totally agree that his trying to retreat from, he does seem to try to retreat from reality towards fantasy in some way. In fact, even when Hermione comes in and says that his crumble-horned Snorkax horn is not that, but rather an Arumpin horn, he sort of attacks her and says that she's known to be closed-minded. But it's almost like, and maybe I'm stretching things, but I'm thinking to Macbeth, also King Henry VI in Shakespeare, also Richard II, also a little bit King Lear in Shakespeare. That something about Xenophilius is he almost seems to retreat into fantasy from reality and to replace reality with fantasy. And maybe that will connect some with the fact that we actually read a fairy story in his presence. So another instance of writing and art within this. But we've heard in the past that his wife died and that Luna's mother died. And we actually see from a picture of her there that she used to be a little more put together. And so, just as part of one of the broader themes of what we've talked about is how do families deal with trauma? Of course, Tom Riddle came from sort of a traumatic situation in which he lost his family, in which his mother had been traumatized over and over again by Marvolo, her father. We see Harry and how he sort of strives to become a hero. Now we see sort of like the roots of why Luna might be kind of off and kind of weird, and that seems to be sort of, besides having a very good and generous nature, that might be in some way a result of her father's love of the strange because of sort of a rejection himself of reality, almost as if he, just to mention the Hallows, has himself sort of attempted to use a resurrection stone to bring something into existence that doesn't belong there, or to attempt to retreat to another form of existence that is not real. I don't know.
Yeah. So Sarah, what did you?
I was just going to say that a lot of what you just said, Alex, was what I was thinking, and those are in my notes as well about his name and kind of the irony that he, like, his hospitality, his Xenia is like tainted, shall we say, with like a alternative agenda, but also his I too was thinking about his strangeness and his fondness for the strange, maybe being not a direct consequence, but an understandable reaction to trauma or to the world being too much as it is. But I also think it's interesting that until Luna is taken, or what we learn later, she was taken to silence him. It is this very strange man who is in some ways committed to seeming fantasy, and he is the one who speaks quote unquote truth, right? Like earlier in the book, when the three of them eavesdrop on Ted Tonks and Dirk Cresswell and I think Dean Thomas, and I think it's who says, "Oh man, if you're still reading the Prophet, you're just getting nothing but falsehoods. If you want the truth, you should read the Quibbler." I think it's interesting that someone who is so strange and maybe gets so much wrong, especially when it comes to that, like the horn that he keeps, so it also ends up lighting on truth, right? Like there's something about that I find intriguing, or maybe there's an underlying meaning in that. There's a quote on like page 411 to 412 where Hermione, it's like pure logic, these things aren't real, this is a fairy tale, and she says, "How can I possibly prove it doesn't exist? Do you expect me to get a hold of all the pebbles in the world and test them? You could claim anything's real if the only basis for believing in it is that nobody's proved it doesn't exist." And he says, "Yes, you could. I'm glad to see that you are opening your mind a little." So it's almost as though like having a really open mind means he's open to like all of the things, including the crazy and the true, I don't know. Is that a message that we should all do some dirigible plums or something? Is this a drug, by the way? It sounds like it might be, but I don't know.
Okay, so I totally agree. There are three things I see there. So one is I totally agree that he's open to things that other people are not open to. And some people in poetic circles, they make a distinction between Homer and Virgil, saying that Homer is a naive poet where Virgil is a sentimental or secondary poet, and saying that sort of Homer sort of just transcribes what goes through his head, whereas Virgil is more literary and conscious. And people use that as strangely to me, a criticism of Virgil rather than of Homer, which I think could be turned on its head. But part of the consequence of that is, though he is more open to figuring things out or maintaining positions that others might not when they are true, he is also, as you said, far more likely to hold positions which are incorrect. But in a time when there is no legitimate or trustworthy source of information, perhaps his sort of intuitive way of doing things is best, even though he is clearly wrong about multiple things, especially that extremely present horn on his mantelpiece. Just something sort of interesting about that, though, is that one thing we talked about at St. John's doing the Aristotle Politics seminar last week was that a problem with a society is when it tries to reduce itself to being a household. So like if you force people to be generous, then they become more unified in that they are more uniform, but they become less unified and less complex and differentiated in that they no longer have the virtue of liberality. They can no longer choose to freely give to each other. And so something that Aristotle says there is that it is inappropriate to make something that is complex, to reduce it to something simpler, if you lose the virtues of the complexity there. And it just strikes me that with Xenophilius, even though there is something gained through his desire to keep his mind open, that he also loses the virtues of discernment, which somebody like a Hermione offers as well. So I do think that he is opening our minds to newer things, but that sort of that, somebody might call it sort of an Eastern way of looking at things, that all are one, and perhaps at some level that's true and useful to consider, but it is the differences between things which are real, which A, are real, and B, like a beautiful Persian rug, make the whole more beautiful, is sort of what I would say in response to that obliquely.
Yeah,
I mean, oh, go ahead, Wes.
No, I wanted to just quickly interject about the story he tells, how he mentioned something that made me think of St. John's, since you brought it up. He says, let's read the story out loud so we all have the same understanding, basically, right? Which I think is such a brilliant, to go back to the kind of teaching idea, like what we can learn about teaching from these books. That's a really simple thing, but something that's really overlooked, I think, is just like how powerful it is to read out loud in one another's company and then like see if the understanding that comes through is the same. And we see it's very, very different, right? When you get to the end of the story, each of the three, Harry and Hermione and Ron, have a totally different take on what the actual message of the story is. And it's very interesting that they start from the exact same place. But yes.
Yeah, so Sarah.
I was just gonna say that what do we make of the fact then that it's his magazine, like his work, his livelihood, where he is speaking the truth about the current administration of the Ministry of Magic, right? Is it merely that like sometimes it like is the lesson? I mean, to reduce it to a lesson is I know problematic, but is it that sometimes truths or like accuracies can only be arrived at when you consider the impossible? Like, to pick up on the Sherlock Holmes idea that once you eliminate all of, like, however impossible something might seem or be, if it's what you've deduced, then it has to be true. I mean, I guess I like the fact that he is the one, you know, speaking truth to power, shall we say, and he's doing so publicly. He's publishing articles. Like, what do we make of that he is also crazy? I mean, like, does that mean that like, what are we supposed to take away from that? I think is where do you know what I'm saying? Like, as a figure in the media, I'm not like, usually credibility would be erased by the fact that he doesn't have discernment. He doesn't have a clear sense of lines between truth and non-truth, or like reality and fantasy, as we've been saying. So the fact that he is also publishing what we as readers know to be the truth about Harry and Voldemort and what's going on in the wizarding world, what do we make of the fact that he is not credible and yet credible?
As you're talking about that, I have a thought about the sort of larger problem of the political sort of media landscape within the Harry Potter world, right? Like, it's because the reputable and sort of more judicious normally sources have been like captured, right, by the evil of Voldemort's sort of coup, that they cannot give accurate information anymore. They give, you know, false information. And so in that context, his work, Xenophilius's work, becomes the only place where you're going to find true things. And of course, you're also going to find, you know, a lot of crazy stuff along with the truth, right? But that seems to me to be more an artifact of the problem with the reputable media outlets, and not so much necessarily, you know, telling us that we have to be open to seeing the world the way Xenophilius sees the world. And so I think that there's an interesting problem with Xenophilius too, where when he gets captured as well, right, then he stops telling the truth, right? It's the same problem that afflicts him as afflicts the other more evidence-based, maybe more logical or whatever news sources. So once he has to sort of fall into line, then he does so, right? And he, you know, probably feels badly about it, but that there it is.
You know, that just makes me think, you've just cleared up a major brain fog for me, Wes, because what's interesting is obviously it's ideal when the prophet gives the truth. They're discerning, they have the top-notch, they have top-notch writers plus Rita Skeeter, and it's a very useful mechanism of helping the wizards to understand their, you know, current geopolitical situation, their just current situation. But when that source of truth is compromised, one has to look for other sources. And in fact, you know, we've seen another sort of irrational, odd source of truth too, which is in the prophecies and in Sybil Trelawney, who is herself sort of an unreliable source of information most of the time. And which makes me think about something you once said to me, Wes, which I think about almost daily right now, which is that you first played video games and you had an idea of this world, and then that idea would make you say go to other iterations of the video games, whether it be Final Fantasy or The Legend of Zelda, and that from those iterations of the games, those stories about hero arcs, you then moved on to stories. And not just stories from your contemporary time, but ancient stories. And so here we have sort of a breakdown of consistent primary information about reality as it is, with a spread of misinformation. And so where is it that these people go to find truth? And we do find that there's also an underground radio station called Potter Watch, which I thought was interesting. They go back into the past. And again, this is something that Hermione, oddly enough, even though Dumbledore gave her the tales of the book, the Tales of Beedle the Bard, does not consider necessarily a relevant source of information, though she does know it's important. She keeps saying that they're just fairy tales. But where is it that these kids go searching for truth? And you're making me understand that as Dumbledore has disappeared from this world, this sort of source of truth, or this legitimizing force, this unifying or ordering force in their world, their reality, is that this whole search has been for truth and has been very, 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 it has not borne many fruits yet, especially going to Godric's Hollow and now to Xenophilius. And so where is it that these kids now eventually have to go? Back to an old fairy tale that Hermione says, well, that's just a fairy tale. It can't be real. And so I suppose my question is that what happens? Is that what is being modeled for us in this fantasy reality, that when the consistent or the sure sources of information become corrupted, one has to, I'm not even sure where I want to say one has to look, back into fantasy, into eternal fairy tales, which could, is of course not only fairy tales, but also sort of, I think, an obtuse reference to religion as well, or to religions that once were strong that are no longer strong, or perhaps also are sort of have always been Gnostic too. I'm not sure if the Deathly Hallows has always been a minority sect of people. But, something that we did realize in this work itself is that, A, why are Hallows weird when Horcruxes are real? And B, we actually find out that the Hallows exist. And so I'm not sure exactly what to do with that. What do y'all think about that, sources of truth, and where to look when it seems like all is dark?
I mean, I agree with that in terms of looking to stories as the sort of place where truth is contained, even if it's not recognized. I think that, again, this is another way in which you can kind of get around the Xenophilius problem that I think, Sarah, you're wrestling with. Like, he's kind of conveying a story, but he didn't invent this story, right? He just has a particular interpretation of it. And his interpretation, again, has some kernels of truth probably to it. It doesn't mean you have to go whole hog with it and wear the Deathly Hallows on your robes when you go to a wedding, right? Like you don't have to become a seeker of them the way that he seems to be, while yet sort of acknowledging that there is some truth there. And again, I think that question of interpretation is brought to the fore in the way that each of the kids takes the story a little differently. It's brought to the fore again, I think, in the weirdest part of this reading we did for today, which is a bit later, when Harry is having that kind of dilemma, like Horcruxes or Hallows, right? And he makes what seems to be the right decision, but he's strongly tempted to say, throw it up and just go after the power, right? It's represented by these Hallows. He sort of has to understand something about himself. And I think it's bound up with actually one other interesting aspect of the story that's told is about how the brothers, it's because they can use magic and they can walk over this bridge they create out of thin air that they cheat death and that they get the Hallows in the first place as a gift, right? And so that use of magic thing comes back with him digging the grave for Dobby, right? He chooses to do it the right way, as he says, do it properly. And not use magic, and so there's something again about this kind of deeper sense of like power that isn't magical in the fantasy sense, but is magical in the real sense, right? Of having a deeper truth to it that's not really acknowledged in daily life usually, which I think can be summed up as love, as Dumbledore likes to say, or maybe music or something. These other manifestations. And I think story is certainly one of them.
Yeah,
go on.
I was just going to say that I think because the fairy tale is about cheating death, and death figures pretty prominently as like the giver of these three objects. I think putting that story in conversation with death in this particular reading, which is Dobby's, by the way, made me cry. Made me cry in the movie, made me cry reading it, listening to it, all of it. Anyway, but I think putting those alongside one another is really interesting. And then also what you just said, Wes, like when Harry has that internal debate about whether or not to go after Horcruxes or Hallows, I think it's also important to consider that Hermione is like really resistant to the idea that these Hallows exist at all, as like a trio of things that specifically come from, you know, the figure of death and have these three specific powers and whatnot. And I think to all place it in conversation with like the absence of Dumbledore's, I just see a lot of chess pieces on the board that I think are really important, and I want to just see if I can draw a couple of connections. So I might lose the thread in my mind. It seems as though when Harry makes the decision to go, like, I think it's interesting that these three objects from the story and the Horcruxes, what do they? I mean, when I was reading that scene where his mind is kind of conflicted about which does he go after, I think I wondered, like, well, what do they have in common? They're all like objects that stave off like eternal death, right? Or they stave off, or they're like, and I think that's significant, but for Harry, what we've seen him, I guess, be faced with is, or forced to reckon with, is a reminder at seemingly all of the books, but maybe not all of them, that like you can't. That's like all of the deaths that he's been dealing with are things that are out of his control. Like I guess for me, I feel like the lesson of this, like the place where the power of story comes in, is not like, does the story like give you a quest to go on, right? Like, oh, I'm gonna believe that these three objects from the figure of death are real, so I'm gonna go look for them and I'm gonna collect them and they're gonna give me power. But is there something deeper that it can teach you about human existence and about death and its role in like natural life? And like it almost reduces the story by a quest for every individual to go on, I guess. I think it reduces the power of the story, and that I'm not sure that that's something that Harry understands consciously, but I think that's certainly what I get from it. Like an attempt to collect all three of them would and I don't know. I think the scene with Dobby, he realizes he's not like nobody masters or conquers death. Nobody does. And at the end when he's burying Dobby and he feels just like this overwhelming sense of grief, he even recalls like the absent teacher, like he recalls what Dumbledore would have called the thing that he's feeling. It seems to me that like in the absence of the teacher, you kind of have to be in this world of like without a compass. I don't know. And I'm not sure I'm articulating myself well here, but
or just the
anyway,
golden.
I'll leave that for you guys.
I know, I think that's fantastic. And you just sparked many, perhaps helpful thoughts in me, Sarah, because yes, perhaps you have to go by your own compass, which is an image we see in a lot of modern fantasy, right? Not only the golden compass in the His Dark Materials series, that is Wes's favorite, but also, you know, Jack Sparrow has a special compass in the Pirates of the Caribbean. But just two things about what you said. It's so interesting seeing literature within literature, like an attempted ekphrasis or a description of art within epic. And I think you're right to draw our attention to that, both Sarah and Wes. And we see the image of three over and over again. And it's so interesting seeing three, because not only is that holy in terms of like the Christian, especially Catholic sense of the Trinity, but you see it in many folk tales, the three little pigs, Goldilocks and the three bears. Also Harry Potter and his two friends. There are three of them as well as the three brothers. And then this story itself seems to have some elements of the three billy goats gruff, who are going over a bridge, but are not as magical as these three brothers. And it's as if this three sort of is a helpful limiting aspect, as if what these three brothers represent and these three objects are three attitudes towards death that are individually themselves perhaps inadequate to facing life. So one seems to be a very youthful one, the elder wand. You can win any duel, but what's left out is that, well, you only win when you duel. People can kill you without dueling. They can, there can be subterfuge, which reminds me quite a bit of Julius Caesar, which I just read, where he's described as having 3 wounds after he's died. And then, of course, there's the arrogant brother who wants to bring those who are dead back. And I think we see both of these perspectives play out in Harry's mind during this reading. He also thinks, like Voldemort, of getting the Elder Wand. This seems to be the sort of naive, not superficial, but sort of youthful, undeveloped perspective that Voldemort never got past. It's also shared by Ron, that Harry also considers or also flirts with. But then there's the second perspective, the arrogant one of thinking that you can defeat death, which at first I think seems like sort of the Christian idea of defeating death last, but is ultimately sort of the opposite of that perspective, because the way that one becomes equal with death is sort of in this Odysseus and the Phaedo by Plato sort of sense, where he just sort of blends in, right? He puts on an invisibility cloak. He becomes totally unremarkable, and thus is totally remarkable in a way. And so just to sort of mimic what you said about not making sense, Sarah, I wonder to what extent which hallow the person would choose indicates their attitude towards death. Can you just never die because you never lose? Can you defeat death by bringing something back? Also, of course, that reminds me quite a bit of the Orpheus legend. I think that's the most direct correlate. And Orpheus does end up essentially getting ripped apart by Maenads after having attempted to bring his bride Eurydice back. And then the third perspective, the invisibility cloak, which is, I find that so interesting because what is it that they already happen to have, these three children? They have the invisibility cloak, which is almost like that's the perspective, that humble perspective that everybody can possibly have, that maybe they don't even know the value of. And so I guess I'm asking whether, do you think you need to know all three of these perspectives to have the correct whole perspective towards death? Or do you think they offer like a developmental line, like everybody starts with wanting the Elder Wand and then thinking that a resurrection stone would be incredible, which seems to in some way be related to the Philosopher's Stone, but not exactly the same. One keeps you alive forever, one brings you back to life. But then eventually you realize that somehow just blending in is the most powerful perspective. I'm hitting a limit here.
I mean, I think that combines pretty well with, I think, what I was getting from your take on it, Sarah, is like, you don't look at the three things literally as three things at all, but that there's like some kind of knowledge to be gained from a confrontation with death, which is something, we've talked about in other conversations as a pretty central theme in these stories. So, I mean, I think in terms of the three options, they're like a starting point for unpacking the story, and it's sort of like an invitation to process the story and converse about it, right? You don't have to take them literally, and you can still use them sort of symbolically. You don't have to take them even really symbolically, but sort of more abstractly as this idea that there is a gift in confronting death, and that, is the way in which you sort of conquer death or something like that. I mean, the idea that like there's a truth to stories, I think is pretty amply attested by the ways that, like you said, this story invites us to look at stories within it and sort of like think about them. We see the characters mimicking that process for us. I think you can also look, to where the sources of this story are and how it kind of is built out of other tales, right? So like Harry Potter is very promiscuous in its adaptation of other fantasy stories, of course. But this particular one about the three brothers has a specific source in Chaucer, in the Pardoner's Tale. He tells a story about three brothers or three young foolish men or something who are supposed to encounter death, and overcome him. And of course they are killed. They kill one another, I think, if I remember right. So there's like a moral valence to the story. But that, of course, is within like the frame of a bigger story of Chaucer's Pilgrims, and so it's very interesting to like you mentioned, Alex, like go backwards through literature, sort of like uncovering, where these sources are, and maybe just see that more abstract sense in which a truth gets transmitted in different forms through the various stories that try to kind of point towards it. In the upshot of all this seems to be like something about, again, Harry, like understanding himself, which of course is, not going to be explicitly contained in the story that you're hearing, but is sort of in that relational component of the telling and the discussing of stories with others, and thinking about them and tracing them and whatever else you might want to do with them, like maybe writing them, right?
That's one of those great comments, Wes, where it's sort of like bam, and I was sort of hoping you would just pick it up, Sarah, but yeah, no, I don't find myself disagreeing with it. No, I was just sort of sitting there and sort of reflecting on it. I didn't have a direct comment to make immediately afterwards, which is always so interesting while being on the air. But of course, we're teachers, not radio personalities. So yeah, just that's interesting. I'm going to have to read the Pardoner's Tale because Chaucer is somebody I'm very weak on. And especially since I teach medieval literature, I need to be a little stronger. But another three we get too is on the Potter Watch. We get Rapier, Romulus, and Royal, though Rapier was going to be called Rodent, I thought was interesting enough. But maybe this connects. Not only do we get an interesting use of story here, but we also get an interesting use of language. First, we get the three brothers' names: Antioch Ignotus, which means unknown, like ignorant or ignoramus. And what is the third one? I have it right here, Cadmus. And Cadmus is a reference back to the creator of Thebes in Greek mythology. Antioch is a very famous, like sort of Eastern Christian city that was fought over during several crusades. And it's also where Ignatius of Loyola, or I think Ignatius comes from there. I don't know if it's the same as Loyola. My Jesuit professors would be very upset with me now, and maybe you can correct me, Sarah. But a couple things is we get nom de plumes here. We get pseudonyms. We get, Kingsley, who's called Royal. We get Fred, who's called Rodent. I don't know if that's supposed to be because he's like Scabbers or something. And then, of course, Romulus, who is the twin of Remus, as well as we learn about the fact that we can no longer use Voldemort's name. We can only call him he who must not be named, or you know who, because there's now a jinx on his name that alerts people to his presence. It's as if as we have to go back into stories and derive our own information from them, plain language is now being used to obscure truth rather than to disseminate it. You can no longer, in sort of a 1984 Orwellian, some people might say nowadays in America sort of way, use certain words, which seems to be the beginning of not being able to hold certain positions. Like there's sort of a forced deification of Voldemort. You cannot call him by his name as if he is a definite thing, like a person. It's as if he's being treated like medieval god who you could not call by the name, right? You could speak about him equivocally or by analogy or by negation, but not explicitly. And so I wonder if you two sense sort of as language is being corrupted and being used in a veiled way, that now the value of story is going up, but that, and again, I'm hitting a limit here, but that it requires something it requires a monumental effort. It requires something new. It requires the use of the golden compass, the mind, without having, a Dumbledore-like figure, a Bernard-like figure guiding one. That's my question to you all. My muddled question to you.
Gosh, I don't know. Wes, do you have a sense?
Well, I mean, I like the idea about the names and how they kind of represent this same problematic situation that we saw with the media, right? It is interesting to connect the secret radio station with the tale of the three brothers as well. I hadn't really thought about it that way. And I mean, the way that everybody right now is sort of in this precise situation of like confronting death, right? It's kind of interesting how the radio medium gets to sort of broadcast to everybody, and yet it has to be hidden, right? So it's a very strange kind of a belly flop of an announcement if you're secret about your announcement, right? It's just kind of paradoxical. But yeah, I mean, I think the names are kind of interesting there, the way that, it's very clear who each person is if you've ever interacted with them before. So there's sort of like a joking, a playful aspect to the pseudonyms. I think Kingsley's is particularly like obvious, right? His royal, his Kingsley. But anyway, the question there about sort of like having to just use your own mind. I mean, I think does kind of bring us back to Xenophilius in a weird way, because his whole problem seems to be related to that. Again, like if you just have your own mind, it can take you in some really strange places. It can, you start building. You might start building a replica of Rowena Ravenclaw's really cool hat. And that's like, of course, like a really important clue. It's hard to notice it because it's dressed up in dirigible plums. So it's just to kind of to kind of bring us back to that interesting problem. I don't know, Sarah, if you had another kind of part of this reading that we should touch on here, if we're kind of circling around something that's pretty difficult to articulate with that.
I think I think it's interesting, like the names that they choose for themselves. Like to choose a pseudonym, you're like both, you're masking yourself to one group of people, but also revealing yourself or like a particular part of oneself to people who are like in the know, I guess. So it's like stories, particularly stories on stage, there's like a revelation in a mask, right? There's like there's both, things are both obscured and revealed when something is done with kind of this veneer of secrecy or hiddenness. And that's also, I think, supported by, not supported, but like that's also, just to add to that, is like the only way you can get this radio show is if you know the password, right? So this radio show isn't, it's hidden for safety reasons, but it's also, there's like a doorway in for people who are already in the club. Like I think in the Old Testament, this is a shibboleth or like a password.
Yeah.
I think that's interesting. Or like that's certainly something that I thought about. Like who is this broadcast for? It's not for everyone. It's for people who are already on their team, right? And I think as a result, like the effect that it has on them is not the same as the effect of the story, because the story, the three brothers, that is for everyone, and you can access it from a lot of different points, right? Like you were saying, they all listened to the same words and came away with different interpretations. Whereas there's one avenue to this radio show, but the listeners are all scattered and like alone probably. My sense of the radio show is that it's there to buoy the disconnected and likely very scared people who are all on the same team. And I think the way they do that, with a combination of news and humor is really interesting. Like the effect that laughter has on the three kids as they're listening to it, or on the three young people, is particular. I mean, I think it's particularly potent, especially in like extremely dark times. But I think that the other, just to go back to the name piece really quickly, certainly the name Ignotus is like in its root quite similar to Ignatius. And there were two Ignatiuses. There's like Ignatius of Antioch, who's like an early Christian saint. And he was pretty adamant about like the power of the Eucharist being like a medicine against death. That was something that he was known for. And then Ignatius of Loyola, of course, is from Spain, but and so not kind of the central, not from like the birthplace of the Judeo-Christian tradition, but famous for a spiritual tradition, or a tradition of spiritual practice that marries a kind of Dumbledore-like figure and your own compass. Like the tradition of Ignatian spirituality is anchored in teaching, right? Is anchored in biblical story, but the way that you read stories in the Ignatian tradition is you imagine yourself in them, and you imagine, like you practice imagination, and so there's like, I think it's interesting to bring up Ignatius. By the way, his birthday and Harry Potter's birthday are the same, but
and Wes's.
And Wes's, that's right. Just like the combination of what we've been talking about, like without Dumbledore, where do you go? Well, you can turn to a lot of places. Dumbledore's like physically absent, and maybe who he was is up for debate in Harry's mind, but it seems as though the storm of that is settling, and that like the truth that about who he was, setting aside some of the questions that Harry's been wrestling with after reading pieces of Rita Skeeter's biography. I think the storm that creates for him is abating, and he is just I think some of the things that Dumbledore stood for and meant to him are maybe being distilled, and like his compass is emerging a little bit more clearly. I think we see that when he buries Dobby. But I would just point out the only other piece of this reading that I think is super important, but the way I'll go into it is what happens at Malfoy Manor, because I think and I think the community, if we want to even call it this, the community of the Death Eaters, and I think we see a good example of this at Malfoy Manor. It doesn't have any of the traits that we were just discussing earlier, right? Like there is a unifying story or narrative in their community, right? Like that pure blood is good and not pure blood is bad. But there's no opportunity for people to engage in that narrative and come away with different conclusions, right? There's no liberty of thought. It's a space, it's a community built on fear and violence and like power. Like they don't even seem to really all like want to connect with one another. Like they seem to be more based on competition. So this radio show, as it sort of establishes and perpetuates a community of really disparate people needing to know that there are others on their side, from afar, like that is a, even though they are separated, they are far more of a healthy community than these people who are hunkering down at Malfoy Manor. And I think that's important.
I totally
that's key.
You've really helped me. Again, you're enlightening me quite a bit, because what I think I'm seeing here is some correlates between, these Order of the Phoenix members and these like normal, good, magical folks, and say early Christianity and the persecutions that they would have faced. But you're also helping me to understand that part of what makes a community of individuals is defining limits by means of the words that are used as well as the actions that are taken. So something sort of interesting about vegans is that many of them don't understand that they're doing essentially a religious act by defining themselves by what they eat against that which other people eat, and not sitting at the same table. Very much like early Jews would not eat pork. And it was the same when I first started doing CrossFit, because there was a specific diet that people ate, the paleo diet, which differentiated them from others. But if I look at the three commentators on Potter Watch, and I look at what they say, it's as if what they are each advocating are aspects of Dumbledore. They're embodying that which Dumbledore offered. They're articulating that which Dumbledore would have offered without him being there. So Kingsley, like a king, what does he ask us to do? He asks us to look out for the Muggles. He shows his care. He says, all you could do, and it actually reminds me a little bit of US, like, if it's not too much of a bother, you can just cast a little helpful spell, not very hard to do, and you might save some lives. That'd be a good thing to do. Very public consciousness. And then, it's mentioned that perhaps he might be a good minister of magic. And then what does Remus do? He gives us expert analysis. He says, well, if Harry were actually dead, this would be popularized by the Death Eaters, and this would be a major win in order to destroy the spirit of the Order of the Phoenix as well, and their morale, as well as those who are holdouts. And so most likely he's still around, and so we get that analysis piece. And then Fred, possibly doing the most important thing, he humanizes Voldemort. Well, after all this hard work, who wouldn't want a vacation? And then we're all laughing. They not only define their group by their certain activities and their shared desire to be helpful and fight against evil, but also they define who they are fighting against. They do not allow Voldemort to become a legend, to become sort of a god, undefinable figure, because if he's undefined, he cannot be defeated. How do you defeat something that's pure imagination, right? They humanize him. They give him limits, just as Harry and Hermione and Ron are giving him limits by actually searching out for his physical limitations, the Horcruxes, but also finding out what it is that he's seeking, because if he is a god, he doesn't need to seek anything because he's already all powerful. But they are discovering his limits by also limiting themselves to an endeavor as well. That strikes me as extraordinarily important, Sarah, what you've brought up. And just to the Death Eater point, they do seem to have a community, but it's a community that, like Plato says about evil, does seem to limit itself, because something that strikes me in this reading always is that, oh my goodness, the Death Eaters would have won had they not been prejudiced against Fenrir Greyback. Had they treated him more like Lupin and given him a wand or allowed him to wield the Dark Mark, bang, Harry Potter is found, killed by Voldemort immediately. Game over. But since they looked down upon him and let him wear the robes, superficially be a part of their group, but not giving him full rights, they fail. And so,
well, that I was just going to say, like, that in Lord of the Rings, this is the case. It's certainly the case in like the Christian tradition that like like in the Christian, in like the theological definitions of evil, that like good needs preservation. It does not. Evil is self-defeating, right? Like it's that which is built on is ultimately its downfall, right? Like and like you said with Greyback, that's a great example. But I also really like the way that you frame that idea about like what each of these three what each of these three people on the radio show, how each of them do something that Dumbledore no longer can't, or no longer can,
Right.
excuse me, because he's not like walking on this earth. I think it also brings up that like no one person can do all the things, right? And so like, you know, every single one of these Death Eaters wants to be the one person that is the, you know, the most important. They don't recognize the value that other people might have at the table. It's like, it's built on competition, right? This is my house. I'll do the calling. Like, no, you don't have a wand, you know, like this is, who can prove themselves most necessary. Well, I think each of these three figures recognizes, and that's something that Dumbledore does really well, right? Is that when he was alive, which is recognize what another person is good at and allow them to go do that for the group instead of trying to like diminish that and become good at it himself, right? I think that's really important. It also, I think, adds to the kind of, well, I'll say that, but I think if there's three radio hosts as well, there's also, you know, like the three Hallows, right? And do each of those sort of represent something that Dumbledore? I'll just throw this out there. I think we'll learn by the end that each of those maybe represent something that he had to understand, or he had to come to learn, not just about death, but also about life, and like what makes a good life. Because even though those three Hallows are ways of staving off death, what they really are, I think, also is an illustration about what makes a good life. Is it power? Is it like time with loved ones? Is it like putting your head down and doing a good job? Right? Anyway, I think that's what you just said, Alex, is really great.
Awesome. I would just throw out a couple other examples, I think, from the Malfoy Manor section that kind of prove the rule. Malfoy himself, Draco, that is kind of an exception, because he's not trying hard to like say, oh, it's Harry, like let me kill him, I'll redeem myself, right? No, he's quite the opposite. He's protecting them in this scene. It's very interesting. And you know,
why
Dobby,
do you think
the same way.
Why do you think he does that? I was just gonna say, yeah.
I mean, I think it has to do with the kind of, you know, shame and guilt that he must be wrestling with at this point, and he, you know, must sort of see that there no good is going to come of helping these people who've like taken over his house and, you know, demeaned his family, and I don't know, it could even extend to go so far as that he's, you know, like kind of a la Snape, you know, has this very deep buried you know, shard of goodness in him. Peter Pettigrew's the other quick example, right? Like the hand, you know, kills him because he has this one little tiny movement of pity. It's a very Smeagol, you know, moment there. So those two little episodes, I think, are worth throwing out there too. But I know we're kind of going long.
Yeah, and I definitely want to start with that silver hand, that sort of hand of fascism, that Darth Vader force choke, tyrannical killing of the human element within Peter and just himself, who had been so dehumanized by his actions, in fact, becoming you know, a rodent for so long. I think we're starting to understand that a bit symbolically, right? Like he actually literally turns into a rat, just like Milton's Satan literally turns into a serpent from being a celestial being at the beginning, though disfigured with darkness. And I do want to pick those elements up next time, because I do think they're fascinating. I'm sorry, what was the first example again? Just because I was going to go on that train, but then I dovetailed. There was Peter Pettigrew and what I was going to say about Draco is that, in agreement with you, it's almost like what Draco has realized is that these are his friends. even though he has been antagonistic to these three, they've been such a big part of his life. And it's almost as if sort of under the surface, and we started seeing this, I think, in the last book too, where he was struggling so much with doing his dark deeds that he likes being antagonistic to a certain level, but he seems to also like the whole, even though he insults Hogwarts and all of that, within his world, he seems to like the world as it is. And this also strikes me as, to some extent, Lucius Malfoy's perspective. Like, Lucius Malfoy, before the Dark Lord came back, had quite the wonderful life, very high in the magical dominance hierarchy, and one of the governors of Hogwarts. He owes a lot to Hogwarts in the same way that Tom Riddle owed a lot to Hogwarts, in the same way that Harry Potter owed a lot. So I agree that there's some sort of kernel of goodness, and it's almost as if, Draco is, he likes to be smug and arrogant, but to a point. Because, it is very striking that even though these three children are, again, trying to obscure themselves and, again, taking on false names, and Harry even has a false face, that he's, even when his parents ask him who these people are, and even if that would mean that they would have tremendous glory over all people and that the ultimate goal of Voldemort would be realized, Draco still, he I wouldn't say stumbles or falters, but hesitates. And that's, I think those are excellent examples to end with too. And so, well, Sarah, you have been sort of taking us episodically or cinematically through this text, and I was sort of hoping that we would get through a very specific chapter, which I'll tell you which after you tell us where you think we should go to for next time. So this time we've gone through 20 and 25. Cinematically speaking, which chapters should we tackle for next time?
I'm afraid of getting it wrong. Shit.
There's no wrong answer.
I mean, my sense is we should get through chapter 30, but just because I think 31 through 36 seems like a good chunk for the it's, I don't know, that seems even, but what did you want? Well, I don't care.
No, that sounds perfect. I was just thinking 31 very superficially, just because then then we have 6 more chapters essentially afterwards, and I wanted to read more. But no, I totally agree, because that Battle of Hogwarts, that's going to be a big time chapter.
Yeah, I think 30 sets us up for, and then 31 through the end is basically all of the climax. There's so much though that, like, I don't know that we might have to have like a part 1, part 2 type situation for our conversation, because I know that chapter 33 will have a lot to talk about, and chapter 34 and 35 and 36. Like we might have to read it and then approach our battle plan, so to speak. But I think there'll be like so much to discuss that we might need like the movies,
Right.
Before we go, can I just tell you my favorite image from this reading was,
yes.
and also made me tear up while I was hiking and listening to this, is when we see that Luna has painted all of their faces on her room. And there's like a little chain that just says friends, tying them all together. That was so sweet. And like, when we see her again, she is just the best. I'm sorry. Like, she's so good.
Yeah. Well, and it just, this time reading through was the first time I understood that she was being bullied, and that part of her retreat to sort of a fantastic reality seems to be her dealing with the unkindness of others. And so, with these Ravenclaws who are considered so cerebral, I definitely teared up too, seeing this Friends and just seeing how important these people are to her. And especially because, she's always been sort of on the outside for them, and Ron will still sort of make fun of her, calling her loony. And then just, yeah, I thought that was a very powerful moment, I thought, as well. And so, yeah, Wes.
She's the only one good enough for Neville, who is the other. It's our birthday. So, yep. She's the only one who's up there with him.
There it is. And well, so this is one of our rare morning episodes. Maybe I actually quite like this during the summer, and summer is such a wonderful time. And this is something we do out of pure leisure. And so it's the highest activity according to Aristotle, which is something we debated last week and something that's wonderful to be involved with. But I've got some coffee and water right here because it's a bit early in the day to be drinking for me. No judgment for anybody else. But but I'm having coffee with y'all. What would y'all like to clink and then disperse with?
Yeah, I'm going to go have some tea, I think, and get going on some chores here. Good old summertime cleaning and whatnot around the house. So, yep, little tea.
Get the burrow up to grade, yeah. And then Sarah?
I'm still on my first cup of coffee for the morning, so I'll probably make another one. And I don't know what I'm up to. It's kind of rainy here, so I've been driving for caviar, and I think I'm going to go do that for the lunch hour. It's fascinating. Fascinating.
Is that a food delivery service?
Yes.
That's so
interesting.
Yeah, that's something I've thought about doing ad infinitum. And, if I ever change my position in the education world or do something like that, I'll definitely talk with y'all on the air about the reasons for it, because we all do something slightly different with it while also doing something slightly similar with it through this. And so, yeah, it is so interesting what the life of an educator affords you, which usually is not, well, sometimes is not much materially speaking during the year, but is certainly worth its weight in gold over these 2 months that we all get together to pursue leisure. Well, y'all, bottoms up.
Yeah. Cheers to that.
Cheers.
Have a good one.
Too.